The night was a thick veil of darkness, pierced only by the pale, flickering glow of Lucas's flashlight. As he approached the gates of the long-abandoned Silent Echo Slaughterhouse, an uneasy silence blanketed the air. The rusty iron gates groaned in protest as he pushed them open, the sound echoing unnaturally into the distance. Overgrown weeds clawed at his boots, as if warning him to turn back. The once bustling facility now stood like a skeletal corpse of its former self, its walls covered in peeling paint and deep claw-like marks. A faded sign hung precariously above the entrance, swinging in the cold wind, its letters barely legible. "Welcome to Silent Echo." Lucas, a seasoned journalist, had chased many urban legends, but this place carried a reputation darker than most. Locals whispered of the slaughterhouse's cursed history, workers who vanished, machines that roared to life without power, and screams that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He dismissed the stories as embellishments, but now, standing before the oppressive structure, his skepticism wavered. He couldn't shake the sensation that the building was watching him, its shattered windows like eyes, unblinking and hollow. The air inside was colder than it should have been, damp with an acrid metallic tang that clawed at his throat. His boots crunched against shards of broken glass and the brittle remnants of something unidentifiable. The beam of his flashlight danced across the walls, illuminating strange stains that trailed down like frozen rivers of blood. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water. Or was it water? Each drop seemed to echo with an unnatural resonance, louder and heavier than it should have been. Lucas stepped cautiously into the main processing room, his heart hammering in his chest. The ceiling loomed high above, cloaked in shadows that seemed to pulse and shift. Massive hooks dangled from rusted chains, swaying gently though there was no breeze. Suddenly, a low, metallic screech tore through the silence, sending a jolt of terror through him. His flashlight trembled in his grip as he whipped around, finding nothing but emptiness. The sound had come from the far corner of the room, near a pile of decayed machinery that looked as if it had been untouched for decades. Then it happened. A blade, impossibly sharp despite years of disuse, glinted under his flashlight's beam and moved. Just slightly, as if it were alive. He froze, breath caught in his throat, every instinct screaming at him to run. But curiosity, that insidious force, rooted him to the spot. His mind raced to rationalize what he'd just seen, but the faint whispering that followed shattered any attempt at logic. The whispers were faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but grew louder, more distinct. They weren't words, at least not ones he could understand. They were guttural, desperate, like the cries of something not meant to exist. Lucas's flashlight began to flicker, plunging the room into intervals of strobe-like darkness. Each flash revealed something new, a shadow that seemed to stretch toward him, a faint figure near the machinery, and then nothing at all. Panic clawed at his chest as he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a chain that slithered underfoot. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the whispers, but the feeling of being watched intensified. Somewhere deep within the slaughterhouse, a sound rose, slow, rhythmic, and chilling. It was the unmistakable sound of blades sharpening. But there was no power. Nothing should have been working. The hairs on the back of Lucas's neck stood on end as he turned toward the sound. His flashlight caught a fleeting glimpse of a figure disappearing into the shadows, a figure that moved unnaturally, as if its joints were all wrong. The sharpening grew louder, almost deafening now, as if beckoning him deeper into the slaughterhouse. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Lucas stood there, his body trembling, his mind screaming for him to leave. But as he gripped his flashlight tighter and took a deep breath, he knew he had no choice but to move forward. This story, whatever it was, demanded to be uncovered. Unseen eyes seemed to follow him as he stepped into the darkness, each step a defiance against the oppressive fear tightening around him like a noose. The whispers returned, faint and mocking, as if the slaughterhouse itself were alive, watching, waiting, hungry for its next victim. Lucas pressed forward, his breath shallow and uneven. The oppressive darkness seemed to fold around him, heavier with each step he took into the slaughterhouse's depths. His flashlight's beam swept across the walls, catching glimpses of rust-streaked metal and grotesque carvings that looked too deliberate to be random. Suddenly, his light stopped on something half buried in the dust, a small, leather-bound book. Its cover was cracked, the leather dry and brittle, but an eerie symbol had been burned into it, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, resembling a sun consumed by shadow. Curiosity overwhelmed his fear as he bent down to pick it up. The pages were yellowed and damp, sticking together in places, but the handwriting was still legible. It was a worker's journal, written in a hurried, frantic scrawl. The entries were mundane at first, describing long shifts and grueling conditions. But as Lucas read further, the tone shifted. The machines, one entry began, they don't stop anymore. Even when the power cuts, they keep moving. And the screams, God help us, the screams, are getting louder. His fingers trembled as he flipped to the last entry. We tried to shut it down. We tried everything. It's not the machines, it's something inside them. It feeds on the noise, on the fear. And now it's too late. It's taken Sam, and I think I'm next. The page ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted. A dark stain seeped through the bottom of the paper, and Lucas realized it wasn't just dirt, it was dried blood. The air grew colder, and he felt a presence as if someone, or something, was watching over his shoulder. Then, a strange sensation washed over him. The handwriting on the page looked familiar, almost as though he'd seen it before. A memory stirred deep within him, hazy and incomplete. Years ago, his grandmother had warned him about this place. There's a darkness there, she had said, her voice trembling. It's where your uncle disappeared. He was never the same after working there. Lucas had dismissed her stories as paranoid ramblings, but now, standing in the heart of the slaughterhouse, they felt disturbingly real. A metallic clang echoed behind him, snapping him out of his thoughts. He spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but the hallway behind him was empty. Yet the sound persisted, a slow, deliberate dragging, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Lucas's heart raced as he remembered a detail from his childhood, his uncle's hands. They had been scarred, deep grooves running across his palms as if he had tried to pull himself free from something. His uncle had refused to speak of it, but his haunted eyes had said enough. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, until it was just beyond the next door. Summoning his courage, Lucas pushed it open. The room was smaller than the others, filled with broken furniture and shattered glass. But in the center of the room, illuminated by his flickering flashlight, was an old locker. It stood slightly ajar, its hinges rusted and warped. Scrawled across the door in what looked like dried blood were the words, "It waits for the blood it was promised." Lucas's breathing quickened as he hesitated. Against his better judgment, he reached out and pulled the locker open. Inside, hanging from a hook, was an old work jacket, tattered and stained with something dark. A name tag was pinned to it, the letters faded but still recognizable. Samuel, the name from the journal. Lucas stepped back, his chest tight, as the faint sound of whispers filled the air again. This time, they were louder, more distinct, and unmistakably calling his name. A sudden jolt of pain shot through his arm. He looked down and saw a faint scar running from his wrist to his elbow, one he didn't remember having before. But as he stared at it, fragments of a memory resurfaced. A child's voice, trembling with fear, screaming for help. His grandmother's frantic cries. And then silence. It was here. It had always been here. The slaughterhouse hadn't just claimed the workers. It had taken a piece of him, too. Lucas staggered backward, the whispers crescendoing into an unbearable roar. His flashlight flickered violently before going out entirely, plunging him into darkness. In the suffocating black, he felt something brush against his arm, cold, wet, and impossibly human. And then, just as his mind threatened to unravel, the dragging sound returned, this time from inside the room. Lucas's pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out every rational thought. The dragging sound echoed from the darkness, relentless and menacing. His flashlight sputtered back to life in a sickly glow, barely illuminating the room. The shadows seemed to shift, as if alive, encircling him like predators. He stumbled backward, his breath hitching, when his beam caught something on the far wall. It was a crude, hand-carved message, jagged and uneven, as though etched by trembling hands. "Choose or become one of us." The air grew colder, and a pressure built in his chest, heavy and suffocating. From the shadows, a figure began to emerge, not fully human but not entirely spectral either. Its form was shrouded in darkness, but its eyes burned with a sickly yellow light. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. Lucas felt frozen, his legs rooted to the spot, as the figure raised an arm and pointed directly at him. A guttural voice filled the air, not spoken aloud but invading his mind. "You cannot leave without sacrifice." Before he could react, the room shifted violently, the walls pulsating as though the building itself were alive. The locker containing Samuel's jacket creaked open further, and a horrible, wet scraping sound filled the air. Lucas turned to see the name tag on the jacket glowing faintly, and from it, images flooded his mind. He saw Samuel, alive but terrified, standing in this very room, surrounded by the same darkness. Then came the screams, Samuel's screams, twisted into inhuman wails as he was dragged into the machinery, his body twisted and broken, his soul consumed by the slaughterhouse's insatiable hunger. The vision subsided, leaving Lucas trembling. The figure in the shadows stepped closer, its distorted features becoming clearer. Its face, if it could be called that, was a grotesque amalgamation of human and machine, with jagged blades protruding from its skeletal frame. The voice came again, louder this time, shaking the very air. Choose, your pain or your soul. One must stay. Lucas's mind raced as the meaning of the words became clear. The slaughterhouse demanded a price, always had. It wasn't enough to escape. It required an offering, a piece of whoever dared to intrude on its cursed domain. He realized with dawning horror that his uncle's scars and haunted eyes were a result of this exact choice. His uncle had paid a price to escape, leaving part of himself behind, both literally and figuratively. The figure gestured toward the locker, and Lucas's flashlight flickered again, revealing another object beside the jacket. It was a photograph, worn and faded, showing Lucas as a child, smiling alongside a man, his uncle. But something was wrong. The man's eyes were hollow, empty, and his hands were clutching Lucas's shoulders with an unnatural force. The photo began to smolder at the edges, and the same guttural voice rasped in his mind. Memories, pain, or freedom. Choose now. Lucas felt tears welling in his eyes as the enormity of the choice crushed him. He could sacrifice a cherished memory, one that tied him to his childhood and the only family he had left, or endure unimaginable pain to escape. But the voice whispered again, insidious and taunting. Freedom has its own cost. Pain will linger, but the memory, it will be gone forever. Is it worth it? The shadows closed in, pressing against him, suffocating. His flashlight failed completely, and he was left in utter darkness, alone with the figure and the unrelenting whispers. His hand instinctively reached for the photograph, now glowing faintly in the dark, but his body recoiled at the thought of losing the one connection to his past. The alternative, facing whatever torment the slaughterhouse had in store, seemed equally unbearable. Suddenly, the dragging sound returned, now deafening, as though the walls themselves were being torn apart. The room seemed to collapse inward, the shadows merging into a swirling vortex of despair. Lucas's screams were swallowed by the noise, and he realized he had only seconds to decide. His fingers hovered over the photograph, trembling, while his other hand clenched into a fist, bracing for the pain he might endure instead. Time slowed. The figure's glowing eyes burned brighter, its jagged smile stretching impossibly wide. Choose, Lucas, or I will choose for you. The air was thick with dread as Lucas stood frozen, torn between impossible choices. But before he could decide, a new sound filled the room, a whisper, soft and serpentine, slithering into his ears like venom. It wasn't the guttural, commanding voice of the figure that had haunted him moments ago. No, this was something different, more insidious. The whisper spoke in fragmented sentences, pieces of thoughts that seemed to come from deep within his own mind. You've been here before, haven't you? Lucas's flashlight sputtered back to life, its beam weak and trembling, casting erratic shadows that moved unnaturally along the walls. The shadows seemed to grow darker, richer, as if absorbing the light. They stretched and twisted, forming shapes that looked almost human but distorted, incomplete. The whispers intensified, layering over each other, growing louder, until they sounded like a chorus of voices. Each voice was distinct, yet all carried the same tone, despair and accusation. Why did you leave us? One voice hissed. You knew the cost, another whispered, sharper and filled with bitterness. He spun around, the flashlight catching glimpses of fleeting shapes in the corners of the room. One moment, they seemed like ordinary shadows, but the next, they moved with purpose, leaning closer, reaching out. Lucas stumbled back, his foot catching on a loose piece of metal, sending him crashing to the ground. As he scrambled to his feet, his flashlight illuminated something that made his blood run cold. The walls were alive. The stains he had dismissed earlier as rust now pulsed like veins, and the surface writhed with faint, ghostly faces pressing outward, their mouths open in silent screams. The whispers turned into a low hum, resonating deep in Lucas's chest, vibrating his very bones. His vision blurred as he struggled to focus. The shadows were closing in now, taking form. One shape stepped forward, more solid than the others. It was a woman, her face half concealed by the darkness. She wore the uniform of the slaughterhouse workers, her features twisted with anguish. She reached out a trembling hand, her voice no longer a whisper, but a broken plea. "Help us, please." Lucas hesitated, unsure whether she was real or another cruel trick of the slaughterhouse. But before he could react, the other shadows surged forward, their forms jagged and unnatural, like broken marionettes. They encircled the woman, dragging her back into the darkness despite her desperate cries. Her voice echoed in his mind, a chilling lament that would not fade. "We didn't choose this, we didn't choose this." A cold hand brushed against Lucas's neck, and he spun around in terror, his flashlight flailing wildly. There was nothing there, but the feeling lingered, the icy touch seeping into his skin. The whispers returned, sharper now, accusatory. They spoke of betrayal, of debts unpaid, of lives stolen. "This place remembers you," one voice snarled. "You belong here." Lucas's breathing quickened as the room seemed to shrink around him. The walls loomed closer, the faces within them writhing more violently. He realized with mounting horror that the voices weren't just the souls of the workers, they were pieces of him. His past, fragmented and stolen, trapped within this cursed place. Every choice he had avoided, every fear he had buried, every memory he had tried to forget, they all lived here, haunting him. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows pressed closer, suffocating. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, Lucas saw something carved into the floor beneath him. A circle, filled with runes he couldn't understand, but somehow felt connected to. Blood pooled at the edges of the symbols, fresh and glistening. The whispers turned to laughter, cruel, mocking, as the runes began to glow. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Lucas could hear his own heartbeat, frantic and erratic, as the shadows froze. Then, in a voice that was not a whisper but a roar, the room spoke. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. You are part of this place, and it will take what it is owed." A sudden gust of freezing air extinguished his flashlight completely, plunging Lucas into total darkness. He felt the shadows pressing against his skin, not just around him but inside him, filling his lungs, his veins, his very soul. The whispers returned, faint but persistent, carrying a single message: choose wisely, or become one of us. As Lucas stood trembling in the suffocating black, a single thought consumed him. This was not just a haunted place. It was alive, and it had been waiting for him. Lucas's mind was a storm of panic, his thoughts splintering like fragile glass under the crushing weight of terror. The whispers that had tormented him began to morph into something darker, visions. They flashed before his eyes, rapid and disjointed, pulling him into a nightmarish world where reality itself seemed to unravel. Each vision was sharper than the last, clawing at his sanity, forcing him to confront fears he didn't even know he possessed. The first vision gripped him like a vice. He stood in a hallway, long and narrow, lined with hooks dangling from rusted chains. The sound of dripping echoed faintly, and he realized the liquid falling from the hooks wasn't water, it was blood. The air was thick with the metallic tang of iron, making his stomach churn. The whispers returned, low and insistent, weaving through the silence like snakes. They didn't just speak, they demanded. "Do you hear them, Lucas? The ones who never left." As the vision blurred and shifted, Lucas found himself back in the slaughterhouse's main room, but it was different now. The walls were coated with flesh-like textures, pulsating and alive, as if the building itself had become a living, breathing entity. Shapes writhed beneath the surface, clawing at the walls, their faces contorted in agony. The whispers turned to screams, horrific, bone-chilling wails of torment that seemed to come from every direction. Lucas clutched his head, trying to drown out the sound, but it only grew louder, piercing his skull like shards of glass. The next vision struck like lightning, vivid and inescapable. He saw himself as a child, playing in a field on a summer's day. The memory felt warm and distant, a fleeting reprieve from the overwhelming darkness. But then the sky darkened, and a shadow fell over him. He turned to see a figure standing at the edge of the field, watching him with hollow eyes. The figure lifted an arm, pointing toward the distant slaughterhouse, and Lucas felt an icy dread wash over him. The memory twisted, the field dissolving into ash as the laughter of children turned to cries of despair. When the vision faded, Lucas collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The whispers became more sinister, taunting him with questions that cut deeper than any blade. "Do you think you're brave? Do you think you'll leave this place whole?" The shadows around him seemed to move with purpose now, circling like predators, feeding off his fear. Every breath he took felt labored, as if the air itself resisted him. The slaughterhouse was no longer just a setting. It was a presence, alive and malevolent, twisting his perception of time and space. The whispers now spoke directly to his mind, their words laced with poison. "We see you, Lucas. We know your fears. Do you?" At that moment, the air grew heavy, suffocating, and his flashlight flickered weakly in his trembling hand. The beam caught something horrifying, a mirror, cracked and smeared with streaks of blood, leaning against the far wall. Against every instinct, Lucas approached it, drawn by an invisible force. As he stood before the mirror, his reflection stared back, but it wasn't him. The figure in the glass was gaunt and pale, its eyes sunken and void of life. Its mouth moved, but the words didn't match his own. "You've already lost, Lucas. Fear has claimed you. It always does." The figure raised its hand, and Lucas felt his own arm lift involuntarily, as if he were a puppet. The reflection smiled, a chilling, grotesque grin, and then shattered, sending shards of glass flying in all directions. But instead of falling to the ground, the shards hovered in midair, each one reflecting a different fragment of his fear. One shard showed him drowning in darkness, unable to escape. Another displayed him consumed by fire, his screams silent against the roaring flames. And the largest shard showed the slaughterhouse itself, alive and hungry, devouring him piece by piece. Lucas stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The whispers grew louder, their words forming a cacophony that threatened to tear his mind apart. "Fear is your master. You cannot fight it. You cannot win." The shadows began to close in, their shapes twisting into nightmarish forms, long skeletal limbs, hollow eyes, and mouths that stretched impossibly wide, emitting silent screams. The walls of the slaughterhouse pulsed and breathed, and Lucas felt the ground shift beneath him. He was no longer sure if he was awake or trapped in another vision. His own mind seemed to betray him, showing flashes of his deepest insecurities, his worst failures, and the faces of people he had let down. The slaughterhouse was feeding on his fear, growing stronger with every moment he remained inside. Lucas clenched his fists, desperate to regain control. But the visions refused to stop, and the whispers continued their relentless assault. He was no longer just a victim of the slaughterhouse. He was its prey, and it was playing with him, testing the limits of his sanity. As the shadows closed in around him, Lucas realized that the only way to survive was to confront the fear head-on. But could he? Could anyone truly face their own terror and emerge unscathed? The slaughterhouse seemed to pulsate with life, each beat a reminder of the malevolent force that controlled it. Lucas felt like an intruder in its domain, his every movement watched, judged, and manipulated. The whispers, now a cacophony of despair, grew louder, pressing against his mind like claws scraping at his sanity. The shadows around him no longer lingered at the edges of the room. They advanced, closing the distance, writhing and shifting into grotesque forms. He could feel their cold breath on his skin, hear their hollow voices calling his name. At the center of the room, the machinery loomed, massive and grotesque, an altar to the slaughterhouse's dark power. The gears, long dormant, began to creak and turn, grinding against one another in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The sound was deep and resonant, shaking the very floor beneath him. The air grew heavy with the acrid stench of rust and decay, and Lucas's chest tightened as if an unseen weight pressed against him. He was being drawn to the machine, an invisible force pulling him closer. As he approached, Lucas's flashlight flickered violently, casting fleeting images onto the walls. Workers screaming, their faces twisted in agony, disembodied hands reaching out for salvation, and a figure cloaked in shadows, watching silently from the farthest corner. The shadows seemed to retreat momentarily, giving way to the faint glow emanating from the machine's center. There, nestled among the rusted gears and blood-stained metal, was something that didn't belong. A heart, pulsating and alive, its surface blackened and veined with red, as though it were forged from the very essence of the slaughterhouse. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a single, chilling voice that echoed in the depths of Lucas's mind. "You have come to face it. To face me. But are you ready to see the truth?" The voice was neither human nor entirely otherworldly. It was ancient, filled with malice and sorrow in equal measure. Lucas felt his legs move involuntarily, drawing him closer to the grotesque heart. His hands trembled as he reached out, compelled by a force he couldn't resist. The moment his fingers grazed its surface, a surge of energy shot through him, pulling him into a vision so vivid it felt like reality itself. He was no longer in the slaughterhouse. He stood in a field drenched in golden light, surrounded by workers laughing and chatting as they harvested crops. But the scene began to shift. The sky darkened, and a deafening silence fell over the field. The workers stopped, their faces drained of life, their bodies stiff and lifeless. From the shadows of the nearby trees, the figure emerged, the same shadowed entity that had haunted Lucas since he arrived. Its voice reverberated in his ears, filled with venom. This place was alive once, filled with hope. But greed poisoned it. The blood spilled here was not for survival, it was for power. And now it takes what it is owed. The vision twisted violently, and Lucas was back in the slaughterhouse, watching the workers' final moments. He saw Samuel, the man from the journal, standing at the machine, screaming as it came to life. The gears tore through him mercilessly, his blood feeding the heart at its core. Lucas could feel Samuel's pain, hear his final cries, and see the moment his soul was consumed. The vision snapped away, and Lucas was thrust back into the present. The heart in the machine pulsed faster, feeding off his fear, his anger, his despair. The voice returned, louder and more demanding. "You see now, Lucas, you were always part of this. The blood of your family fed this place, tied you to it. There is no escape without sacrifice." Lucas staggered backward, his breath ragged. The weight of the truth crushed him. His uncle's scars, his grandmother's warnings, his own suppressed memories. It all led back to this place. The slaughterhouse had claimed his family, and now it wanted him. But the voice wasn't finished. "You can end this, Lucas. Destroy the heart. Break the cycle. Or join the others and become one with me." The machine roared to life, its gears spinning faster, the heart pulsating wildly. The shadows surged toward him, their forms stretching and twisting, clawing at his body. He could feel their cold grip on his soul, pulling him toward the machinery. The weight of his fear threatened to paralyze him, but deep within, a spark of defiance flickered. He had to act, but how? Destroy the heart and risk whatever power it unleashed, or surrender himself to the slaughterhouse and end his suffering. The moment stretched into eternity, the air vibrating with tension. The slaughterhouse waited for his decision, its dark power growing stronger with each passing second. Lucas clenched his fists, his mind racing as he prepared to face the truth and make his choice. The slaughterhouse roared to life, the sound of grinding metal and the rhythmic pounding of the machinery drowning out Lucas's frantic heartbeat. The walls seemed to close in, the grotesque faces within them writhing in agony, their silent screams pressing against his mind. The pulsating heart at the center of the machine glowed with a malevolent energy, each beat sending shockwaves of dread through the room. Lucas stood frozen, the gravity of his next move crushing him. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct, layering over each other like a macabre choir. "Join us, end it, you cannot win." Lucas gripped a rusted metal rod he had found on the floor, his knuckles white as fear threatened to consume him. The heart was alive, its veins pulsing like serpents coiled around the machine. Shadows swirled around it, forming shapes that resembled the workers who had perished here. Their hollow eyes bore into him, their forms flickering between solid and ethereal, as if caught between life and death. One stepped forward, a man with a deep gash across his throat, his voice a rasping whisper. "Save us, or suffer as we have." The shadows lashed out, spectral limbs reaching for Lucas, their touch icy and suffocating. He stumbled back, swinging the rod wildly to keep them at bay. The voice of the entity that controlled the slaughterhouse filled the room, its tone mocking yet commanding. "You cannot destroy me. You are mine. Your blood is mine." The sound reverberated in his chest, shaking him to his core. Summoning every ounce of courage, Lucas stepped closer to the machine, the heat radiating from it searing his skin. The heart pulsed violently, as if sensing his intent. The machinery around it groaned and screeched, the gears spinning faster, releasing bursts of steam and sparks that filled the air with the stench of burning metal. The voices of the dead screamed in unison, their cries echoing like 1,000 nails dragging against glass. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled, and the room seemed to warp and shift. Lucas fell to his knees as the slaughterhouse revealed its true form. The walls dissolved into a black void, endless and consuming, and the machinery expanded, becoming an unholy amalgamation of flesh and steel. Chains hung from above, dripping with blood that seemed to evaporate before hitting the floor. The heart at the center grew larger, its veins stretching out like tentacles, reaching for Lucas. The shadows closed in again, and one figure emerged from their ranks, his uncle. The man's face was twisted with pain, his eyes hollow but filled with a flicker of recognition. "Lucas, don't make my mistake," his uncle rasped. "I thought I could bargain with it, but there is no escape, only sacrifice." His form began to dissolve, pulled back into the void by unseen forces, his final words echoing in Lucas's ears. Destroy it. End this. Lucas felt a surge of resolve. He had to stop this, end the cycle of torment that had claimed so many lives, including his family's. But as he raised the metal rod, ready to strike the heart, the voice of the slaughterhouse grew louder, desperate and enraged. You fool! Do you think you can destroy what has existed for centuries? Do you think your mortal strength can break me? The heart pulsed again, releasing a shockwave that knocked Lucas back, the rod flying from his grip. Pain seared through his body as the shadows descended upon him, their forms twisting into grotesque, multi-limbed monstrosities. They clawed at him, tearing at his flesh, but Lucas fought back, his hands grasping for anything he could use. His fingers closed around the rod once more, and with a guttural scream, he lunged toward the heart. The moment the rod pierced the heart, the entire slaughterhouse convulsed. A deafening roar filled the air, the machinery grinding to a halt as the shadows recoiled in agony. The heart thrashed violently, its veins writhing like snakes, releasing bursts of dark energy that shattered the surrounding gears. The faces in the walls screamed, their mouths opening impossibly wide, as beams of light pierced through the darkness. Lucas's vision blurred as the slaughterhouse began to collapse around him, the walls crumbling into ash and the shadows dissolving into nothingness. The heart let out a final, earth-shaking pulse before exploding into a blinding light, sending Lucas flying backward. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from his lungs, as silence fell over the room. When he opened his eyes, the slaughterhouse was gone. He lay on the cold, damp ground of the field outside, the morning sun breaking over the horizon. The once oppressive air was now calm, the whispers silenced. But as Lucas sat up, he noticed something, a faint scar running down his palm, a reminder of what he had faced. The silence felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still. He turned to look at the spot where the slaughterhouse had stood, but there was nothing, only an empty expanse of overgrown grass. Yet, deep down, Lucas knew the truth. The slaughterhouse might be gone, but its presence lingered, a scar on the earth itself. And as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. The sun had risen, casting pale light across the field where Lucas stood, his breath visible in the cold morning air. The slaughterhouse was gone, reduced to an empty patch of scorched earth, yet its weight lingered, heavy and oppressive. The world felt unnaturally still, no birdsong, no rustling leaves, only silence, as though nature itself recoiled from the horror that had taken place. Lucas's body ached from the ordeal, every movement reminding him of the shadows that had clawed at his flesh. He clutched the scar on his palm, its jagged lines still warm, as if the slaughterhouse had branded him with its lingering essence. As Lucas turned to leave, his steps crunching on the frost-covered grass, a faint sound stopped him in his tracks. It was a low hum, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down his spine. He turned toward the empty space where the slaughterhouse had stood, his heart pounding. There, in the center of the charred ground, something glinted, a small metallic shard, faintly pulsating with a crimson glow. It was a fragment of the heart, impossibly alive, its surface veined with the same dark energy he had destroyed. Lucas hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to leave, but his curiosity pulled him closer. As he approached, the hum grew louder, resonating in his chest like a heartbeat. The shard seemed to call to him, its glow intensifying with each step. He knelt to examine it, and the world around him seemed to blur. A faint voice echoed in his mind, soft and mocking. "You think it's over? You think you've won?" Lucas stumbled back, clutching his head as the whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. They weren't gone, they were waiting, biding their time. He staggered away from the shard, fear clawing at his chest. As he reached the edge of the field, he saw something out of the corner of his eye, a figure standing at the tree line. It was barely visible, cloaked in shadow, its features obscured, but Lucas knew it wasn't human. It didn't move, didn't approach, it simply stood there watching. He blinked, and it was gone, leaving him questioning whether it had been real or another trick of his fractured mind. The road back to civilization felt longer than before, each step weighed down by the sense that he was being followed. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound made him flinch, his nerves frayed beyond repair. When he finally reached his car, parked miles away at the edge of the property, he collapsed into the driver's seat, his hands trembling as he started the engine. The hum of the car's motor was a comforting reminder of normalcy, but as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Lucas glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a split second, he saw them, shadows, dozens of them, lingering in the back seat. Their hollow eyes stared at him, their mouths twisted in silent screams. He slammed on the brakes, heart racing, but when he turned, the back seat was empty. He sat there, frozen, his breathing ragged, until he convinced himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew better. Days turned into weeks, but the memories didn't fade. The whispers followed him everywhere, faint at first, then louder, especially at night. They filled the silence, creeping into his thoughts, reminding him of the slaughterhouse and its insidious power. He began seeing things out of the corner of his eye, flickers of movement in mirrors, shadows that shouldn't have been there, faint glows in the dark. Sleep became impossible, his dreams consumed by the faces of the workers, their eyes filled with accusation. "You were supposed to save us," they whispered. "You failed." Lucas tried to move on, to bury the experience and convince himself it was over. But the scar on his palm told a different story. It itched and burned at the most inopportune moments, and when he looked at it under certain lights, it seemed to writhe, the lines shifting as though alive. The worst came one night, weeks later, when he woke to find his room filled with the acrid stench of rust and decay. His bed was surrounded by shadows, and in the corner, the figure from the tree line stood, watching, silent and still. Desperation drove him to research the slaughterhouse's history, diving deeper into its dark past. He uncovered old records, faded newspaper clippings, and forgotten testimonies. The slaughterhouse had been built on cursed land, its foundation soaked in blood long before the first machine was ever installed. The entity that controlled it wasn't bound to the structure. It was bound to the ground itself, to the suffering and despair of those who had died there. Destroying the heart hadn't ended the curse. It had merely awakened something deeper, something older. The final revelation came in the form of an old photograph he found in an archive. It showed the slaughterhouse in its early days, the workers standing proudly in front of the building. Among them was a man who looked eerily familiar, Lucas's uncle, but much younger than he had ever seen him. And next to him, in the shadows, was a figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. The figure wasn't just a part of the slaughterhouse. It was a part of Lucas, tied to his bloodline, a curse passed down through generations. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't escaped. He had merely become the next link in the chain, a pawn in the slaughterhouse's eternal cycle. As the whispers grew louder, promising his eventual return, Lucas stared at his reflection in the mirror. For a brief moment, his own face shifted, replaced by the hollow, lifeless eyes of the shadowed figure. The slaughterhouse was gone, but its darkness lived on, inside him. And it was waiting for the day it would reclaim him, as it had claimed so many before.